Whoa, that sounds about the right time then. Well, we have 27 participants on Zoom, so that's great. And we're going to hear from Jim on some personal reflections on spaceflight, which I'm really keen to hear about. We'll do the usual on questions if you want. If you want to put them on the chat, Peter can call them out at the end. And if you're watching on YouTube and you want to put them in the comments section, we'll try and pick those up at the end. When Jim's finished, for those who are interested, I found a free simulator today, so you can dock the Dragon X spaceship onto the ISS. It looks a bit of fun. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Jim, and Mark can do whatever he needs to do.
Okay, Jim, why don't you go and share?
Okay, so that looks as if it should be visible to everybody now, yeah?
Looks good.
Good, excellent. Okay, so I don't think I'll be able to follow Tosh's tour de force from last week, but I'll give it a go. I just wanted to manage everyone's expectations. When Andrew asked if anyone could volunteer to deliver some content for the Society's online presence, I racked my brains to see if I could come up with something, and having enjoyed everyone else's labours to deliver content, I thought the least I could do was sort of pitch in, and hopefully it might give other people a sort of an encouragement to contribute as well. So find something you can enthusiastically talk about and give it a go. I'd be happy that we have questions and discussion, and I think Peter's comment about the end is great. It's not a fantastic environment for having an interactive discussion, but it'd be nice if it stimulated some interest to have a chat at the end of the talk. So let me just see if I can get to the next slide. Perfect, right, okay, now I figured out how to do it. I was born a bit too late to have memories of the very first moon landing, but I certainly remember some of the later ones, and this image from the BBC TV coverage, shamelessly stolen from Wikipedia and YouTube. It's the only photograph, by the way, that isn't one of mine in tonight's talk, is exactly the sort of thing that I remember. We had Cliff Mitchellmore presenting, James Burke with a suitable model, and a very slimline Patrick Moore all in the studio. I discovered when I was looking into the sort of background for this talk that there's actually very little of the BBC coverage that still exists. And it was in the days when videotape would be wiped, and unfortunately there's not much left from that time. I guess, like a lot of people my age, the space race and space flight had a formative influence when you were growing up. I certainly had a keen interest in all things space as a youngster, and it's maybe not surprising I sort of continued my interest in astronomy, astrophysics, cosmology as the years progressed. And I've also been able to sort of connect with my interests in a number of ways over the years, and I thought this might provide some interesting content. And just before anybody thinks, this isn't really me showing holiday snaps masquerading as a talk. There is some connection to spaceflight with it. So we'll go on to images which are actually about spaceflight. And the first chance I had to get close to the spaceflight history was holidays to Florida in 1990 and 92. And actually I have dug out a suitable souvenir to wear for the occasion. although it's somewhat tighter than I remember, and may leave me somewhat uncomfortable for the rest of the evening. Anyway, so the trips to Florida, this was done choosing the destination for a relatively cheap holiday, rather than particularly trying to get into the history of spaceflight. At the days where you had a dodgy charter airline that could get to Florida with a refueling stop in Bangor, Maine. And to be honest, the people I was with, I guess, had particular interests in sunbathing, attractions like Disney and Universal Studios, although they didn't take much persuading when I said we should be visiting Kennedy Space Center as well. And so you get images like this, was exactly the sort of thing where if you talk about the Space Coast in Kennedy, it's the rocket garden, which is one of the first places that you encounter. And the image second left on the left-hand photograph of the sort of Gemini Titan II, is particularly resonant of what you remember from your sort of TV coverage of Apollo. The sort of the sort of patterns and design is what you think of from that time. And these were this was the precursor to Apollo, based around intercontinental ballistic missiles, of course, which was it's a sobering reminder that the space program came from the technology. It was really about delivering nuclear weapons. And quite rightly, NASA was showcasing some of the historic parts of their past. And to the left of the Gemini Titan II, there's a full-scale replica of the Mercury Atlas rocket that sent John Glenn into space in 1962 as the first American to orbit the Earth. And then just to the right, the small rocket with the vertical black and white stripes is a Mercury Redstone rocket, and that provided the first crewed launch vehicle for the US, albeit that the first passenger was a chimpanzee. Alan Shepard did follow 4 months later. The other white rockets that you see are Juno and Delta rockets, which were used for satellites and probes. And on the right-hand side, the main rocket on the left was an Atlas Agena rocket, which was responsible for launching missions to photograph the moon's surface ahead of it. And so you get a sense of the quite important historic place these rockets played in the history of spaceflight. They're all around 80 to 100 feet tall, and so fairly big if you're standing next to them, but not anything like the next one, which is the Saturn 1B. And you can see the people standing on the left of the photograph, which really starts to give you a sense of the scale of this rocket. It's 223 feet high, and this was the last remaining intact and flight configured example. It launched Apollo 7 and later 3 missions to Skylab, of which more anon. I'd like to thank Mark for his initial image, which was a very good shuttle. My first encounter with the shuttle was quite probably an unfamiliar one. This is Ambassador, which was a full-size model. And it wasn't a name that immediately sprang to mind. And when I saw the photograph, I then had to dig out some searches online to find out a bit more about this, because I certainly hadn't remembered anything about it. Apparently built for a traveling space fair, sponsored by Pepsi Cola, it could be split into transportable segments. So as well as Kennedy Space Center, it got to South Korea, Peru, and Chile. But after that, the trail has gone cold, and no one seems to know where it is. So if you have seen a full-scale mock-up of a space shuttle, that might be it. And of course, since the end of the shuttle program, Kennedy Space Center now has one of the actual shuttles on display, and Atlantis is there. And maybe I need to go back to see that. There was a sort of an image or a mock-up of the inside of the shuttle cockpit, and you know, it does give you a sense of just how cramped the conditions were. There's not really a lot of room in any of these places. So for all the sort of large scale of the rockets that it takes to get out of the Earth's gravitational field, or into orbit, you know, the amount of space the astronauts have is pretty small. And you know, if we're talking about large scale, probably everyone has heard of the Vehicle Assembly Building, well known as the largest single-story building in the world. And it's also often quoted about the microclimate that there is, where clouds can form in the roof of the building, and you know, what I don't think this photograph really does is the size of it. Even that, you know, we can say, well, here's a standard person standing in the foreground. I don't really think it helps to for you to appreciate just how large the building is. But I'll give you some things, you know, which help me to sort of give it the sort of sense of scale. If you look at the American flag, the stripes that are on the flag, each one of those is 9 feet wide. And the blue part of the flag, where the stars are, is the size of a standard basketball court. And I think that really brings it home to me just how massive the building is. Of course, everybody wants to claim that they've got the biggest building in the world. And so I thought, oh, okay, we'll see just how it compares with other places. And, you know, so where do you go? Well, obviously Wikipedia. And so in terms of overall volume, the Vehicle Assembly Building is only the 7th largest building in the world, with the crown being taken by the Boeing aircraft factory in Everett, Washington, which is about 3.5 times the volume of the Vehicle Assembly Building. And as an aside, I have been to visit the Boeing aircraft factory, and if you ever get the chance to go on one of their tours, it is a fantastic place to visit, well worth seeing. To have things like jumbo jets being assembled on the factory floor in front of you. The only unfortunate thing about them is they impose a very strict no photography rule, which is a shame. So you know, it's not quite the biggest by volume. And another interesting comparison I found was that a building which is about 75% of the volume of the VAB is the O2 in London, formerly the Millennium Dome, which I would not have placed as being such a large enclosed space. So you know, there it is, and you know, it won't be a surprise that the building was constructed the way it is because of the Saturn V rockets that were assembled there. So next on the ginormous stakes is this crawler transporter that was used to take and is used to take rockets and shuttles from the Vehicle Assembly Building to the launch pads. Once again, you know, the photograph doesn't really sort of give too many clues about scale. It's about, I think, 25 to 30 feet in height. it might have helped with having the standard person standing next to it, but not on this occasion. And not surprisingly, when they were built, they were the largest sort of self-powered vehicles in the world. Okay, so the crawler transporter took you to the launch pad, and here we have a picture of a launch pad. As part of the Kennedy Space Center experience, you can take a bus tour around various parts of the site. Everything, of course, a sort of safe distance from locations. Quite understandable. It's a working facility. And you know, again, you know, as someone who grew up with TV coverage, you know, these places were instantly recognizable when you saw them. And the eagle-eyed amongst you may notice the telltale image of a space shuttle fuel tank and booster rocket. And during our 1992 holiday, there was a shuttle launch scheduled, so we decided to join the crowd and pay a subsequent visit to see the launch. And so this was the mission, STS-47, which was launched at 10:23 in the morning on 12th September 1992. It was the second flight of Endeavour, and its objectives were largely around a joint US and Japanese collaboration, Space Lab J, which had materials science and life science experiments. And there were also a number of what NASA had as a program called Getaway Special, which allowed interesting individuals or groups to have small experiments. And when I was looking at the, let me just clear into it, make myself disappear, the mission documentation, which I got as a Christmas present from my brother a few years ago, which was a very nice idea. I was able to have a look and see what these Getaway Special experiments were, and I was intrigued because in amongst things like behavior of yeast, fluid dynamics, you know, there was one about the growth and mechanisms of a chemical garden, sponsored by Independent Television News of London. It turned out that this had been a schools competition which ITN had run, and they the winning school was from Ashford in Kent, and they had their experiment scheduled to fly in the shuttle. It was a bit later than they'd anticipated. Unfortunately, they won this competition in, I think, '84, and it had been slated to go in 1986, but unfortunately the loss of Challenger and the delays to the program meant that it wasn't until 1992 that their experiment flew. And there was also an experiment that was in conjunction with amateur radio stations, where they were experimenting to try and have crew voice communication with amateur radio enthusiasts who were within the line of sight. I also discovered that there was a sort of what was potentially a breach of NASA's rules on this flight. Up until this point, there had been a rule in NASA that married couples could not go into space. And on the flight, Mark Lee and Jan Davis had secretly married a few weeks before launch. And so NASA was forced to waive their rule because they couldn't cancel the mission or reassign the crews. From what I read, NASA were not very pleased about this because there was a lot of what might be termed somewhat prurient speculation from the media about what might happen with the crew in space. NASA was forced to point out, A, there wasn't a lot of space, and B, the physics of zero gravity made life probably more difficult than it would be. Yes, that was so we had a first, first married couple in space were on that shuttle. When I look back, it was a bit of a sort of schlep to get to view the launch. I think we had to start from at 4 a.m. in Orlando, where we were staying, because you had to be at Kennedy at a certain time. You were herded onto buses to be taken to a viewing point. One hairy moment, we were on a bus and we had to pull over because the vice presidential motorcade had to pass us, and there was some concern that we were actually going to get to the viewing site in time. I think we made it just enough time, not comfortable, but just enough. The vice president in question was an individual, Dan Quayle, which some of you may remember. It's interesting to consider that at one point he was once the butt of jokes about the poor standard of American politicians. I think he's been overtaken since then. So eventually we did make it to the viewing area. As you can see, and not surprisingly, it was pretty busy and quite far away. From memory, I think this was about 8 miles from the launch pad. And actually, until the moment of launch, it wasn't exactly clear what we would see. But obviously, from here you can see that the shuttle is just probably clearing the tower. And of course, at that distance, the sound of the launch came later than what you were seeing. So I took a few photographs to sort of follow the progress, and so we had a clear view because of the sort of flat country, and then sort of gradually climbed, headed to orbit for its almost 7-day mission. So I think we're very fortunate. We happened to be on holiday at the right time. The shuttle launch was, exactly when it was scheduled to be launched. There weren't delays. You think that there must be so many other people who've not had the same luck. My final slide from Kennedy Space Center, is the Space Mirror Memorial. My first visit was in 1990, and that was relatively short time after the Challenger accident. And this memorial had been erected by the time we were there for the second visit in 1992, and it was created by the Astronauts Memorial Foundation to commemorate astronauts who gave their lives in pursuit of knowledge that lies beyond Earth. And as well, in this photograph, as well as the crews of Apollo 1 Challenger, there's others who lost their lives in test flights and training accidents. And sadly, of course, the crew of Columbia, which disintegrated in 2003, have now been added as well. So that concludes my visits to Kennedy Space Center, and I've had a number of other quite fortuitous interactions with the space flight. And in 2008, I visited Washington, DC, which is home to a selection of great museums, and the most prestigious of being those which are part of the Smithsonian Institution. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum quite rightly has the pick of exhibits, and I have a few photos to illustrate the breadth of its collection. This is Lunar Module LM2. It was built for an unmanned Earth orbit test flight, but this was then deemed unnecessary, and it was used for ground testing prior to the first moon landing mission. For the display here, it's been modified to appear like the Apollo 11 lunar module Eagle. And just nearby, they have a display of the docked Apollo Soyuz configuration. It's a sort of restored Apollo Command and Service module used for testing prior to the mission, a backup docking module, and a model of the Soyuz spacecraft. And this was another, I guess, important part of what I was growing up, because as I got older, it was missions like this that were, sparked my interest a lot more. If you've been to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, you'll know that it doesn't just have the facility in the National Mall in Washington. It has the Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center in Virginia, which is quite close to Washington's Dulles Airport, which is very convenient because I was flying from Dulles and I was able to visit here before I caught my flight home. And so this location has more space for larger exhibits, such as the Blackbird SR-71 supersonic strategic reconnaissance aircraft. A Concorde is there from Air France, and the Enola Gay, which dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And the ample space means that they've got the chance to display lots of planes, including a Hawker Hurricane, which had a note on it saying it was coming from Dumfries and Galloway Aviation Museum, which I had never heard of, and I'm not sure there is a Dumfries and Galloway Aviation Museum, but that's what the card said. So this image or these images, it's a couple of pictures of the Apollo 11 command module, Columbia. If you're talking about, historic sort of artifacts from spaceflight, you probably can't get much more historic than that. And, it's not a surprise that the Smithsonian would have first dibs on this. Carefully protected, of course, so that you can't get your grubby hands all over it. But I think fantastic that you're able to get up so close to see it. Now, what we're doing here, next slide. Now, you may not be able to read the card on this one, but this was the main crew hatch on the Apollo 11 command module. And one of the things that the card tells you is that this design was modified after the dreadful fire that killed the 3 Apollo astronauts in January 1967. It took initially a much longer time to open the hatch, and clearly they needed to find a way of opening the hatch very, very quickly. I did discover that, when I was trying to find out a bit more, this is not currently on display now, so it's not something you will see necessarily if you go to the Smithsonian. Another command module from the era. This one is from Skylab, and this was the Skylab 4 command module, which was from the third and last Skylab missions, which ended in February 1974. And I noted that one of the things that they did on this Skylab mission was they observed the comet Kohoutek. And who remembers the comet Kohoutek? I remember being taken out. I think Peter is signifying he did. I remember being taken out by my father, and we went to go and try and see the comet Cohete. I think the fact it has such a memorable name means it gets imprinted on your brain. And also on display in this centre near Dulles Airport is one of the sort of rocket engines from a Saturn V. Again, you know, it's one of the iconic things that you want to look for, and you know, being able to stand next to that. I mean, you know, the scale is unbelievable. To think, you know, there are 5 of these, you know, wider than I was tall, and you know, again, the displays are good that you're relatively close to these exhibits, and equally, you know, close, you can see one of the sort of Mercury capsules, which was the kind used by Alan Shepard in orbital missions in the early 1960s. And this is again at the Udvar Hazy Center. At the time I was there, they had the first space shuttle orbiter, Enterprise, which was built for atmospheric test flights. It wasn't capable of space flights. There was some interesting background reading that, you know, there were some, you know, initial ideas that, you know, subsequently it would be made you know, suitable for space flight. But as the program progressed, there were some design changes, and in the end it became impossible to, or not impossible, that's not it. It became difficult to it would have been difficult to retrofit this to make it capable. And actually, when the Challenger shuttle was lost, they did go back again and think about whether they could rebuild this one, but they used other parts and settled on a completely new orbiter. You know, it won't come as a surprise to anyone. This is named after the Star Trek space vehicle. I would urge anyone to do an internet search for the photograph of the rollout of Enterprise with most of the Star Trek crew, except William Shatner. That must be one of the periods he was having arguments with the rest of the cast. But it's a particularly cringe-worthy 1970s image of the fashions of the time. It's well worth searching out. And of course, like Kennedy, when the shuttle program ended, the Smithsonian were able to get one of the actual shuttles, and Discovery is now on display at the Smithsonian, with Enterprise heading at a museum in New York. Okay, I've got another picture of it taken from a different angle, and just you know, you can see which it's the one that has the name on it, just in case anyone was in any doubt. And before I sort of leave my photographs of the National Air and Space Museum, I couldn't resist one further image, which is the original 1903 Wright Flyer, where humans first experienced powered flight. It was quite something to see such a historic artifact. If you think about any kind of powered flight, you know, it's amazing to think that this is still in one piece and on display. I hadn't realised it had actually been on display at the Science Museum in London in 1928. In fact, it was still in the UK when the Second World War started, and it had to be spirited away to an underground storage site 100 miles from London for the duration of the war, before heading back to the States in 1948. It's the sort of thing now, it'd be surprising that such a sort of, historic item permission would be given to sort of send it abroad for such a long time. So that again is also well worth a visit. My next photo is not directly related to space flight, but I've included it. I visited the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum when I was in Boston, and if you think about the Kennedy's sort of memorable 1962 speech on sending men to the moon, it was such a driving force for the Apollo program. The library is a great place to explore that period in US history. This is certainly turning into a bit of a travelogue of holiday snaps. My next one comes from the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. And I came across this delightful exhibit from Apollo 13. And it's a caricature of Jack Swigert, who is partly responsible for the development of this malfunctions procedure manual, and it's missing its cover. And the reason it's missing its cover is this was one of the items which was needed for cobbling together their device to convert carbon dioxide into oxygen. If you've seen the film, you'll know the part of the film where this happens, and it's quite nice that there's it's not just the manual. There's something about the particular part of that flight that that manual displays, and planetariums, science museums, actually all sorts of historical museums. I'm always seeking them out, and so I went and found some moon rock in San Francisco, and this was collected by Harrison Schmitt from Apollo 17, so the final moon mission, all sort of carefully behind lots of secure glass. And speaking of the moon, closer to home, but still some holiday snaps. I was in London last year, which coincided with an exhibition to mark the 50th anniversary of the first moon landing at Royal Museums Greenwich. It really was an excellent event, and I've included 3 photographs from the items on display, which caught my eye. I was really struck by this sketch of Neil Armstrong by Paul Cal. He was given access to the crew just hours before the launch, and it's a great image. I'll mention slight marginal peripheral tangential claim to fame here. I've actually shaken hands with someone who's shaken hands with Neil Armstrong. He was awarded an honorary degree by the University of Edinburgh a few years ago, and I've encountered people who met him. Unfortunately, it wasn't a gig I managed to wangle a trip onto. I think there was the ceremony was in the US, and there seemed to be an awful lot of high Hegians who seemed to have to make that trip for the event, surprisingly enough. Also on display was a flight plan for Apollo 11, conveniently open at the page for the landing. And I thought this was a fascinating exhibit. If you can, you can get a sense of how thick this this book is, containing all of the necessary information for the mission. And the idea, compare what things were like 50 years ago. Then it was all printed and bound in a hardback book. So the people who were compiling the information, if you imagine all the checking and the printing that would have to go through, the editing, if you had to make a change, what would how would you deal with that? Fascinating exhibit. And it covers all of the activities. The column roughly 1/3 from the left, which has got some quite dark black borders, is essentially a time stamp, and it covers the entire duration of the mission. To the left of that, under CSM, they've got what the command module pilot is doing, and then to the right of it, under LM, they've got the activities for the commander and the pilot in the lunar module, and in the final column, there you can see what Mission Control Houston are doing. And it was amazing just to see everything sort of down to the precisely the detail of what everyone was expected to do at what time. And I thought well worth grabbing a photograph of that. And also on display, more moon rock. Although you might be struggling to notice this, above the Union Jack, there's a very small sort of plastic display piece, and in there's 4 very small dark points, which is the bit of moon rock. And the label underneath the flag reads, "Presented to the people of the United Kingdom by Richard Nixon, President of the United States of America. This flag of your nation was carried to the moon and back by Apollo 11, and this fragment of the moon's surface was brought to Earth by the crew of that first manned lunar landing." And this was part of a sort of goodwill gesture of diplomatic gifts, which was organized by Richard Nixon, where, in addition to countries of the world, all of the 50 states of the United States were given these presentations. And so, whilst the moon rock sample that I saw in San Francisco was something which was part of very carefully catalogued and traceable samples which NASA has kept, they didn't treat these goodwill samples the same way. And there were 2 tranches of it, one from Apollo 11 and another lot from Apollo 17. And the card underneath at the exhibition, I'm not sure whether you might be able to read it, screen it up. I'll just tell you what it says. That in total there were 270 of these goodwill presentations from the Nixon administration, and there are now 180 of them which are unaccounted for, which have either been lost, stolen, or sold in the black market. And clear, this caption says it from this one came from 10 Downing Street. Thankfully, this country has got archivists who seem to be quite good at taking care of things, and could presumably lay their hands on this when somebody said, "Could we have this for the exhibition?" And other countries, perhaps, who are, maybe have not quite such stable governments, have perhaps no idea in which cupboard all this has been stashed, or if it still is even there. Coming to the end, I've only got just 2 or 3 more photographs. I was in California and stopped for another somewhat unexpected encounter with the history of spaceflight last year. I was driving north from Los Angeles, I just stopped at a viewpoint to take some pictures over the Antelope Valley and discovered that this is the Aerospace Valley. They all had the right stuff. This plaque had been dedicated in 2003 to mark the first century of powered flight, and it highlighted that some of what they reckon are 150 first flight milestones associated with the area, from things like breaking the sound barrier, traveling at Mach 6.7, being the first person to see the curvature of the Earth, and the manufacturing home of the Space Shuttle orbiters, which was in Palmdale, California, which was relatively close by. And on my travels in California, I did do a quick roadside grab shot of this sign as I passed another historic location for spaceflight, which was the landing site of where most of the early space shuttles landed. And they do have a flight test museum there, although unfortunately it's on the airbase itself. And so it's only open for tours for the general public once a month. You need to reserve in advance, and probably it will only let in US citizens. So I think there was no way I would get to visit the flight test museum, but I'm sure it would have been well worth it. I've now got a photograph of my own bit of spaceflight history, which I picked up. Not only have I got a rather tight-fitting polo shirt, I also got a piece of shuttle tile insulation material. Now, whilst they tell me that this is the authentic tile insulation, which has been manufactured in accordance with the same processes and specifications and using the same high priority raw materials, it's not a tile, it's just made of the same stuff, right? And helpfully they do say that it should not be ingested or inhaled. So I'll put it back in it's rather lovely presentation box. But yeah, for $15, you too can have a bit of the same stuff that made the thermal tile insulation for the shuttle. And if anybody's got time on their hands currently, has anybody got time on their hands? Who would know? You might want to spend a bit of time doing some Apollo in real time. You can choose from Apollo 11, Apollo 13, Apollo 17. No spoiler alerts. You probably all know how each one ended, but somebody's put together a vast amount of NASA audio, some videos, photographs of the missions that you can follow. I did do a bit of sort of the launch of Apollo 11, but once it had launched, I felt that the 2 or 3 days it was going to take probably was not worth me spending my time. And I'll finish with one final photograph. I was swearing about whether I should show this one, but that just to prove I was there, but it's a very different me from the time. This was a launch pad in 1990, which also used to have a shuttle on it. But yeah, we didn't have that. We didn't see any launch at that point. And that those are my personal reflections on manned spaceflight.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. That was very entertaining, and quite a few of us have suffered hair slip. So,
well, I'll tell you one thing, Andrew. It doesn't mean that we're not worried about lockdown haircuts.
Not a problem.
Not a problem.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jim. Any questions? Or
there's a number of observations, but I've got a question first. Jim, are you still
there, Jim? Yes.
Yeah, there you are. I'm going to bring you up as a presenter because I can see you. Right. I was living in North London in the early 80s. And I was thinking about the thing you said about the mock space shuttle. I lived near Alexandra Palace. And on one afternoon, I saw the jumbo jet carrying the shuttle fly over Alexandra Palace.
Wow.
And I think it was on some sort of world tour or something. I don't know about that, but I doubt if it would be a mock-up one that we'd have on the top of a jumbo jet, but I don't know. Do you know?
Pass. Google search that, you know, there'll be information about it. There'll be information about it somewhere. Yep. And at that time, of course, it's interesting because people didn't carry cameras generally around.
That's right. Yeah.
With them, whereas now you can whip out your phone.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that there must be so many things that people saw that never get recorded in the way things get recorded now. It's just different.
They did do some world trips, didn't they, to test the emergency landing sites? I don't know if they landed there and tried to take it off and put it back on again with cranes or whatever. Because was there one of the airfields in Scotland an emergency diversion site? Is it Macklelynch or whatever it is?
Macklehanish.
Yes.
Macklehanish, yeah.
As it was then. It's changed name since then, hasn't it? It's Campbelltown now, is it?
No, it's always been both.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
But I thought that wasn't that an emergency landing site as well as somewhere in the Canaries and a few other strange places?
Yeah, there was a number around the world, wasn't there? Yeah.
Yes.
I think the Scottish landing site is Prestwick.
There was a landing site in Spain.
Yes. Yeah.
There's one in Oman as well.
Oh, right. Yes.
Homework for everyone. Find out all the emergency landing sites.
Well, in this
Sounds
case,
like they weren't very confident about it being successful if you've had that many options for emergencies.
Oh, well, it's just safety, isn't it? But the flight path over Alexandra Palace was heading for Heathrow or leaving Heathrow. It was either one of the other. So whether it actually landed or not, I've no idea.
I was amused, Jim, that in your pictures you showed the flight plan and the immense detail that it goes into. And I used to get called names at work because I always insisted on version control on documents. I can imagine what version control would be like on those sorts of things.
It'd be pretty tight.
Which one have you got?
Now we have some observations. And I'm going to call on the individuals to make their observation if they want to. Nigel, you were first.
Oh, it was just the question about, is there an aviation museum at Dumfries? Well, yes, there is. Whether it's still in business or not, I don't know. The last time I've never visited it, but last time I was in its vicinity, some of the exhibits, certainly the ones outside, were in a very poor state of repair. So, but there is one there, or has been one there.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that. It just struck me as odd when I was reading. I mean, it was nice that there was a Hawker Hurricane on display in the US Museum. Fantastic. Yeah. And then you read the thing and it said courtesy of Dumfries and Galloway Aviation Museum. Well, that's interesting. I wasn't expecting to see that.
They used to have a very tatty MiG sitting outside for a long time with molds going on it.
Perhaps it's best that the hurricane is in Washington.
Absolutely, I think it would be taken better care of.
I would think so.
Very, very well tended. Yeah.
Maybe
John
it had
Burrell?
to close down since the Americans have got all the exhibits.
Well, they've got London Bridge, so and the Queen Mary.
John Morrell, you made a comment about the.
Yeah, I was just going to say there is some Apollo material in the Science Museum in London, if you're ever allowed down here again. You're not allowed out at the moment, I understand it, down there. I think I can walk there, but take me a little while, but it's still closed, of course.
Nicola says no.
Oh. Well, I know she shares a surname with me, even though she won't publicise it.
Of course.
Yes.
I was going to say, I have seen the Science Museum exhibits, and I guess the only thing which prevented me from referencing them. Turns out I haven't actually taken any photographs there.
Well, I've got a few, but they're not very good. So it's quite difficult to photograph because it's quite dark in that area.
Yeah,
but you've got the British Black Arrow rocket there as well, the one that put the Prospero satellite into orbit. There's quite a lot there actually, and I think they've also got the Apollo simulator, command module simulator instrument panel there. But it's not connected to anything, so it's just sort of, a grey panel with thousands of dials and switches. So if anyone ever is allowed down here again, go and have a look. And I think there's a piece of moon rock in the Natural History Museum next door.
Right.
So there's certainly a lunar meteorite in there. So if you are allowed out, come down and have a look.
Similarly, at Leicester Space Centre, they have some moon rock.
Yes.
Small, to say the least.
Some of them are meteorites.
They have what struck me, they have like a planisphere, bits of card held together with various gradations on. And it was one of the surveying instruments they used on the moon.
That sounds good. I was just going to say, I looked up the emergency landing sites, and Fairford is the only one in the UK. She's down in Gloucestershire, of course. And the firefighting staff and whatever were trained there in special space shuttle precautions. Because, of course, it had some fairly horrendous chemicals on board, which is why it was quite difficult to put in a museum. Hydrazine and all sorts of nasty things leaked out of it when it landed.
I remember seeing the crew. They had there were special precautions for the crew.
Yes.
When it landed, so that they clearly weren't exposed to it for very long.
Yes, quite nasty.
But David has updated us on what I saw over Alexandra Palace. David.
So you weren't imagining it after all, Peter.
Sorry, just looking at YouTube, and yes, there's a couple of videos on the Space Shuttle visiting Stansted on the 5th of the 6th, 1983, and also flying over Heathrow piggyback, as you were saying. So it does exist. There is photo documentary, maybe a little bit of video documentary. So you're not imagining it.
Okay, well that's good to know. I was beginning to doubt myself there. Now, Mrs. Trellis's friend had a few comments.
I think if Mrs. Trellis has these in the bathroom, I don't think they're going to be terribly sort of in good condition. They're not. They would seem to break. Well, it's crushable, right? And I suspect that her bathroom may have been a bad way if she's tiled it with those.
Well, she did say that she was a bit worried because she said they didn't last very long. So, but
were they all falling off?
Yeah, But yeah. So good on Mrs. Trellis. I don't know whether she's watching on YouTube. I can't see her on any of these screens. So I assume she's in the background.
There's a whole chapter in the Haynes manual on the shuttle describing all the actions for launch and the different recovery areas for when one engine or two engines or three engines break down. It's quite fascinating. I'll bring it in sometime.
Very good. Any real questions?
Just a comment and a question. We were in Florida in 2003, and we visited the Florida Canaveral just for the day, and there happened to be a Delta II launch that night. So they pointed us off to go to Cocoa Beach and watch from there, and the beach was full of people watching the launch. And it was a really impressive sight, but there were lots of space geeks there, and they were saying, "Oh, well, that's nothing compared to a shuttle launch. So much better and so much noisier." And that was pretty impressive, the Delta II. But I could imagine the shuttle was something really special, presumably.
Yeah, definitely. And the thing was that we, to my surprise, I was the least enthusiastic of the four of us about going to see it. You know, it was one of those things we talked about it, and I thought, well, what the others think and the rest of it. And it was like, you're crazy. You know, we're here. You know, we need to go and see this. And I think, again, trying to remember what we did, I think we opted for the Kennedy experience rather than anything else, because you thought, okay, rather than trying to find a location, you think, well, what might it be like from somewhere else? You might not know the best location. And now, you know, there's so much more online resources that you can find. But back in, you know, 1992, information wasn't as readily available. And, you know, you think, well, actually, you know, you pay the money and you do it at Kennedy because, you know, they should know what they're doing with it.
Yeah.
And, you know, as I say, you saw from the photographs, there was lots of people around, but, you know, you did get, an unobstructed view across the launch site, and, you know, listen to it as it roared off into the sky.
Yeah.
Very good.
Does anyone want to see my Apollo Saturn rocket? This is the new way of sharing the screen. Does that work?
Excellent.
Yep.
I've either got a very large radiator or a small Saturn V. I bought myself the Lego model for Christmas. The interesting thing is it's got 1,969 parts, same as the launch year, of course. That was a post-Christmas bit of fun to build that.
I see Will is holding something up to the screen, which
Yeah, see it? I didn't see it, but I picked this up in the States. Just trying to get it. I saw the Saturn, the moon launch souvenir.
Oh.
1969. So interesting. Well, I wasn't around then. Well, I was around.
Yeah, likewise, I was around, but, you know, about
I was very young.
3 and a bit. You know, I think, you know, it's not, you know, I've lived in the Apollo era, but, you know, it's only the later landings that I remember.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jim.
Graham has just pointed out something here that Moore was calling Columbia using amateur radio. Oh. Yeah, it's funny that, you know, the mission stuff I was looking at, you know, there was various things that you do wonder about following up on some of the activities, and, you know, were they worth doing? You know, did they meet their objectives? And, you know, it's, you know, and you know, you think at that point there probably isn't the same historical information, you know, that people would record amateur radio contact now, and it would be, you know, all over social media or whatever. But you know, you just missed out on some of those things at that time.
It's not tremendously difficult, of course. You have to remember that the space shuttle's closer to, sorry, the ISS is closer to you than I am.
Yep.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Well, Alan, you look suitably relaxed. I think it's the way the mountains form on the view we have of you. It looks like you're reclined. Anyway, brilliant, Jim. Thank you very, very much. If I can share my screen, I'll just show you the one thing. I'll have to come out of that and come out of, what am I doing here? Let's just a second. Let me find the screen. There it is. Share. Why doesn't it show?
It is showing.
All right, it's just everything else is in the way from my perspective. Just a second. All right, okay. This is what I was saying. If you go to space.com, if you're interested, you can click on this, and in only a few seconds, right. If you have the time, you get a set of instructions on what needs to happen, what controls you have, etc. I'm going to let you do this if you're interested. And then, oh, you can actually, whoa. Head towards the space station, but I don't make it that easy. So there you go. You can move it to the side, you can speed it up, you can alter the angle, and I'm doing this at an incredible rate, but you get the feeling for it. So if you want to try and dock the space station here, dock the capsule to the space station here, you can tell us how long your best try takes. That's all I wanted to show you.
I put my money on Hugh.
Yes. Okay, I'll stop.
What website was that, Andrew?
Just a minute, let me get rid of this. Unfortunately, I've got the...
It's up the top left.
It is on SpaceX.com.
ISS-sim.spacex.com.
You can find it.
Yeah.
If I can just get rid of it. The I can't get out of it now.
Found it.
Let's get out of it. If you go to space.com, you'll find it there. It's a great place for news, finding out what's going on. I used it a lot and still use it to find out things, so it's always useful. Okay, we'll go back to the presentation then, I think. If I stop sharing, Mark, if you want to pull the, right. So, Friday, we've got a lot of interest in a return visit, I suppose, of the HOYS programme. When Dirk Frobrecht will be talking us through an update of what's happening and how you can all contribute to the science. There's quite a few astronomical societies registered interest, so they will well be joining us. We then followed the following Wednesday when Clive will be taking us back in time to something made in 1941. So a bit of history. I think there are about 23 possible events before August, and I think we've got about 10 of them planned. So there's still a few more to get. So if you've got any ideas, please let us know. Horst will be talking about his sort of history in telescopes, if you like, shortly. And that led me to think that any member who has kit that they want to just take us through, show us its pros and cons, tell us a bit about its history, what it's good for, what it's not, it'd be quite useful and interesting. So to kick it off after Horst's presentation or following Horst's presentation, I've just done a quick tour of the three telescopes I've got. Doesn't have to be telescopes, of course, if you've got a camera or something else that you think people would be interested in finding out. Just let us know and we'll plug into a slot. I have nothing else to say, so unless anybody else has got anything, then I think that's it from me.